Good morning, Breakfast with Bacon fans. I am happy to bring you today's guest. He is a friend of mine, a prolific writer, Dr. Craig von Buseck. I was so excited to have him because I have to tell you, I have read two of your books and I cannot remember the second one. I know and I forgot all the names. So tell me the names of the books you have written, because today we're going to talk about his newest book, Victor, The Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant. Please don't insult him that I can't remember the names of his books. I always pass my books on when I'm done with them. And I'm like, this is a great book. Hey, John Buseck, welcome to Breakfast with Bacon.
Well, thank you, Christina. This is great. It's great to see you. Going down the list, Victor is the most recent, and there's a companion book coming out in May called Forward, The Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant.
Oh, wow.
But then before that, the last book was an award-winning book. It won the CELA Award for the top nonfiction book in Christian publishing. And that book was called, I Am Cyrus, Harry S. Truman, and the Rebirth of Israel.
Yes.
It was also nominated for the Truman Award by the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library. So then before that, we had Praying the News, which I co-wrote with Wendy Griffith, co-host of the 700 Club. I had a book called Nobody Knows.
That's the one.
Yeah, the Harry T. Burley story.
I was thinking Arlie Burley. Yeah, but
one of America's first great African-American composers. I had a book called Netcasters, Using the Internet to Make Fishers of Men, and another book called 7 Keys to Hearing God's Voice. And then there's a few others in there, but that's probably enough.
Well, so I read a lot, and books are good, but there's some books that yours is a step above. So you're a researcher, you are a writer, so you're great at the narratives, but you like to dig in. Maybe it's this type of stories I like to read. You dig into the lives of people. And so we get true details, but then you paint the richness, because you talk to family members, you talk to historians, and then you fill in the blanks of what we might not have known. And so this story, I have to admit, I didn't get to read this one yet. And I am looking forward to, because I'm not a history buff per se. But the way you write the stories, you don't just talk about history. Okay, so Ulysses S. Grant, he's been written about a bazillion times. But I am certain that you bring in the familial, the faithful. So let me just start right here. There has been a re-examination of his life, as I said, probably a billion times, right? So think you told me that there were several new biographies over the past 20 years. Why did you choose to focus on the two final years of his life?
Well, I first heard the story back around the late 1990s, and that was through the Ken Burns documentary on the Civil War. And he just touched on it, and I thought, well, that's fascinating. For those who don't know what happened, I'll just give a quick overview. Grant was a two-term president, and towards the end of his second term, his son Buck had been investing money for him, and they had hit it in the Comstock silver mine. They had hit a lode of a success, and so Grant had a bunch of money for the first time in his life, really, and so he decided to go on a 2-year world tour, and so he was the first president to ever tour the world. And it was such a success. I mean, people came out, thousands of people came out wherever he went, because he was the general who won the Civil War. He was the president who kept the peace. He was the president who pushed forward Lincoln's agenda of equal rights and civil rights. And so he was at the forefront of what was happening in the world at that time. And so it was so popular that President Rutherford B. Hayes sent Navy ships to take Grant wherever he wanted to go, because it was so great for the reputation of the United States. So after 2 years of doing this, the money started to run out. And there were a lot of people who were telling Grant that he needed to run for a third term as president, because Hayes had said he was only going to serve 1 term. And so Grant thought, well, maybe I should do that. So he went back to the United States and he threw his hat into the ring. But unfortunately, by that point, there had been several scandals during his White House years. He was never involved in any. That's the thing that people get wrong. They think that he was the one who caused the scandals. He was as innocent as they come. But sadly, some of his lieutenants were not so innocent. And so that tarnished his reputation. And so he did not win. He lost the Republican nomination to James Garfield. And we all know that he went on to become president. So now
Can you
Grant's like,
place us
okay,
in time for people who are not history buffs? This is right after Lincoln, right? Right after the Civil War
yeah, with
ended,
there was Andrew Johnson was the president after Lincoln
immediately
was
after.
assassinated. Then Grant was president for 2 terms, and then Hayes, and then Garfield.
Right,
And so this would be between the 1860s and the 1880s.
right.
And so by the late 1870s or early 1880s, Grant is now looking for a job because when he left his being the head of all the armies as lieutenant general over all the armies, he had to give up his army pension, which I still don't know why. I haven't been able to answer that question. I guess it was just the law at the time. So he never got it back. They never restored that to him after he was president, which again is odd. Um,
No stimulus checks either?
no stimulus checks and no presidential pension until Harry S. Truman.
Wow.
And so Grant had to get a job. And so I
What do you
told
do
you about
after you're
his son.
president, right?
I know, it's crazy, isn't it? How the times have changed, right?
Yeah.
So, I told you about his son, Buck, who did investments, and he had started a Wall Street firm called Grant and Ward. And so he came to his dad and said, why don't you join this firm? And you can, you know, kind of try to get all your wealthy friends, the carriage trade, to come in. And so they convinced him. And so Grant came aboard, and it seemed like they were making money hand over fist. It was just so successful. And so they called their business partner, Ferdinand Ward, they called him the young Napoleon of Wall Street. But the only problem was the whole thing was a giant Ponzi scheme.
Oh,
So the
no.
whole time, Grant thought that he was worth $1 million. And overnight, the house of cards collapsed, and he had exactly $80 to his name. Only a few weeks after this, he was diagnosed with incurable throat cancer. So now he is penniless and dying.
And he's how
And
old?
what's that?
How old is he at this time?
He would have been in his early 60s. He would have been, let's see, 63 or 64 at this time. And 64 because he died when he was 66, a year and a half later. And so he ended up realizing that he needed to do something to take care of his wife after his death. And so many people had been coming to him and asking him to write his memoirs. But he was raised a good Methodist boy, and you don't talk about yourself, you don't brag, you don't
Right.
attack your enemies, which are what a lot of these memoirs did. And so he found them pretty distasteful. But now this was the only way that he could take care of his wife. One of the people that approached him about writing his memoirs was his friend, Mark Twain, who had his own publishing house. And so in the end, after considering several different publishing houses, Grant decided to go with Mark Twain. And so every day during the last year of Grant's life, with excruciating pain in his throat as the cancer was digging in,
Right.
he did not want to take any morphine or any opiates because he wanted to keep his mind sharp to write the book. Now, he would take morphine at night so he could sleep, but during the day he was in excruciating pain as he sat there writing with a pencil on a yellow legal pad. Every day that he was strong enough, and he finished the book 4 days before he died.
Wow.
The book went on sale later that year, 1865, and it ended up selling. It was the second biggest seller in the 19th century, and it made for his wife $450,000, which in today's money would be more than $10 million.
Wow.
So, in his last act of love and devotion for his wife and his family, he restored their fortune, he restored his reputation. But in that book, he also fought against the growing tide of Jim Crow racism in America, and also what was called the Lost Cause School of former Confederate thinking that said the war was not about slavery, but it was about states' rights or it was about tariffs. And he said, no, very clearly, he came out and he said, this war was about slavery. And while I respect the people that I fought against as former enemies, I believe that the cause that they fought for is one of the worst that people have ever fought for in human history.
Wow. So just listening to you, it always makes me go, I got to get this book. I have a stack of about 10 books here that I'm, on my pile. And I just am like, should I move Craig's books to the front? Because like you just explained, it's not a history book. We're getting into the soul of the man. I mean, so what I'm already seeing is this man who put love of wife and family and humility above self. And that really speaks to the kind of president he must have been, though I can only imagine how diverse the other 20 biographies are. Did you read any of them in your research for this?
I read almost all of them.
Yeah.
There were a couple I didn't read because they were so tied into the lost cause that I thought, why should I waste my time? I know that this is propaganda. But what happened is, beginning right around the same time as the civil rights movement, there was a recognition and an understanding that started to come to historians that Grant was smeared by political spin and propaganda.
No, that never happens, right?
Oh, no, no, never in American history, right? But that's why I grew up and I was always told that Grant was the second worst president next to Buchanan. And I was told that Grant was a butcher and that Grant was a drunk
Wow.
and that Grant was a terrible, bungling businessman who couldn't do anything except fight wars. And even that, he was just a pounder.
And you're
Everything
from
I
the
just said,
South, right?
yes, everything I just said is untrue.
Right.
Now, there are elements of truth that can be explained uh, on how they came to some of those conclusions, but none of that was true in its essence.
Wow. Yeah, because for instance, you told me that he was not an abolitionist before the Civil War, for instance, but he became one,
Right.
so that just kind of shows it as he's understanding, well, you spoke to slavery. Why did he become one? Was it because of what you just said, that he started seeing this issue of humanity and put it in together with his faith? Or what do you think precipitated that?
I think that those are two of the elements. But the third element that I would add to that is that he saw that slavery was a cancer that was ripping the country apart and it was going to kill the country. And so when he realized that, when it came into, his father had been a staunch abolitionist, but his father was also kind of a jerk. And he was really hard on Ulysses. And Ulysses was a gentle soul. He was a horse whisperer. He was much
Right.
more like his mother than he was like his father. And so he rebelled against his dad for many years. And he actually married into a slaveholding family. And after he was pushed out of the army because of his alcoholism in 1853, his father-in-law gave him a slave. And Julia, his wife, had several slaves. So they were slaveholders, not just not abolitionists, they were slaveholders. But what happened is that as slavery was starting to rip the country apart, Grant was going through the worst financial period of his life because there was a massive Great Depression. So here's Grant as a farmer in the midst of a Great Depression. And we know from the
Right.
1930s that those two things don't mix.
Correct.
And so again, people said he was a bungler. No, he was a very good farmer and he worked very hard, but he was in the midst of a Great Depression. And so as that was continuing, he realized that he needed to make some decisions in his life. So he couldn't farm. And so he decided to go back and work for his father up north, who had a chain of leather goods stores. And so he needed money desperately. Ulysses needed money desperately. And he could have sold that slave for $1,000, but instead he gave that slave his freedom. And I think that
Wow.
that was the beginning of him making a stand, saying, I've crossed over from someone who didn't really care about the issue to recognizing that this is killing our country. And so I'm not going to contribute anymore. In fact, I'm going to go against it by giving this person freedom, and I'm going to go up north. And many of his family members and contemporaries looked at that as him preparing to fight in the war because he could see that the war was coming and he wanted to be on the northern side because that's where his belief system was moving.
Was he a Southerner
He
by
was living
birth?
in St. Louis, which was a southern state,
Yeah.
and his wife was from St. Louis. And so when he sold his slave, they moved up into Illinois, which was in the north.
Wow. So how many of his family members, I know, I mean, we're talking 200 years ago. Well, no, 125, right?
Yeah, next year is his 200th birthday.
Okay. So 200 years ago, we're several generations removed, but I know how you are. You're relentless in getting as close to the source as you can. How close to his immediate family did you get? How many generations did you meet
Well, I
anyone?
actually spoke to a couple of Grant descendants, which was kind of cool. Um, then I am a believer, like you had said earlier, that you can't really write something by reading books only or by
Oh,
looking at YouTube videos or whatever. That you have to go to that place. So I didn't get to all of his homes. There were two that I didn't see. One I didn't see because I didn't know about it, and that was in New Jersey. I was
okay.
right there. I could have easily seen it, and I planned to go to it and see it. But the other one is in the far northwestern part of Illinois, in Galena, Illinois, which is where he went to be
After
work
he
for his
left St.
father's
Louis.
leather goods store, and he was there when the Civil War broke out, and he was able to join the army again after much battling. At first, they wouldn't let him in because they said he was a drunk, but
Was
he proved
he?
himself by volunteering and taking this menial job of mustering soldiers back into the or not back into the army. These were new volunteers, and nobody else wanted to do it. And so he told the governor, "Well, I'll do it because you won't hire me to be a colonel, which is what I deserve, but I'll do this." And by doing that, by humbling himself, working hard, he answered every question that was asked. The other soldiers and the other officers were impressed that he knew so much. And so when another colonel was just bumbling his regiment and they were totally out of control, the other officers went to the governor and said, "We want you to fire this guy and hire Grant." And that's what happened. And the rest is history.
Do you have an approximate age for when that happened?
Well, it was 1861. And so that was the beginning of the Civil War. And by that time, Grant was in his late 30s,
That's still a
early.
kid. I mean, but that's great. If you
Yeah.
think about it, I mean, I suppose our military today, we have younger men and women leading, but it's just when you think of someone, we always think of this old man with a big beard, a big kind of burly guy, but he's a young man.
Yeah, he was
mm,
relatively
doing
young.
work.
And the thing that's remarkable is that he went from clerk in his father's leather goods store to colonel and then to brigadier general within 6 months because General Fremont, who was the top general over all the Western armies, immediately saw in Grant, this is a leader. And he promoted him to brigadier general. Within a year, he was major general. Within another year, he was lieutenant general, which was the position last
Right.
held by George Washington. And he was over all the Union armies, more than 1 million men. 4 years later, he's president of the United States.
Wow.
Within 7 years, he went from clerk to president. It's an amazing climb, but it shows his character.
Wow. This is a little bit, probably not a traditional question. What's the number one thing that impressed you? Piece of information that you weren't expecting to find that you found and you thought, wow.
I would say his ability to create strategy that would win would be the thing that I learned about him that I didn't know. When I was reading Ron Chernow's book about Grant, Chernow had written Hamilton, which became the great Broadway hit.
Right. I
And
saw
then
it.
the
It was
next book,
wonderful.
yeah, me too. The next book was about Grant. And so I was reading his book about Grant. And when Grant was at his lowest point after the farm had failed, he was working for a real estate company in St. Louis. And it was, the depression was still going on and things were not going well. And so Grant was there with a couple other people in the office and he was reading the newspaper about some war in Europe. And he read it out loud, just kind of as though he's thinking to himself. And he said, "Well, if I were there, I would have done this, and then I would have done that, and then I would have went around here." And the other two guys in the office looked at Grant as a failure, and as someone who was kicked out of the army,
Right.
and they thought this guy is has delusions of grandeur. But what they didn't know is Grant knew exactly what he was talking about. And so the Battle of Vicksburg, there were a lot of people who thought that Vicksburg couldn't be taken, but Grant took it, and he took it because he had a brilliant strategy. And to this day, there are Army war colleges all around the world that teach Grant's strategy in Vicksburg to help students to understand how to create strategy in war to this day.
Wow.
But
So
his
why
strategy is what beat Lee. You know, Lee was a great general. He was a brilliant general, but it was Grant's strategy that beat him. And that's what people, people said, well, Grant was just a butcher and he had more men and more resources. Well, he didn't have any more men than the other 6 officers that went before him. They all had the same resources. Why didn't they win? Because they didn't have his strategy. So it was, yes, he had resources. Yes, he had men, but he also had the strategy, and that's what won in the end.
why did they keep for instance, the Lost Cause School, this is how was Grant fighting the Lost Cause School? Why is he considered this bumbling idiot, lost cause? Where did that come from? Just because Southerners hated him for going north, or?
No, it was because he was the general that beat Robert E. Lee.
Oh, and they loved him
And they still love him. And he is to be admired in some ways and
as a
to
leader.
as a leader, but he was also very pro slavery, and he was a white supremacist. And we need to be honest about who he was as a overall
Right.
person, just like we need to be honest about Grant. Grant was an alcoholic. We need to be honest about that. But that was a disease that through working with his wife and other friends, he was able to overcome and eventually was able to abstain. And, you have to give Lee credit. After the war, a Black person was in his church and went forward to have communion, which was, you can't have
Unheard
that.
of.
But Lee got up and he went forward and he kneeled next to him, and everybody was shocked. And he said, the war is over and things have changed and we must change with it. So I do give Lee credit for that.
Wow.
So what happened is that the Lost Cause School developed because the Southern aristocracy, or not aristocracy, but academics and historians and writers were so embarrassed that the Southern aristocracy before the war and the planter class pulled the South into a war against the rest of the country that caused utter devastation for decades. And it was over racial slavery. And they were so embarrassed by this that they had to change the story. They had to spin it. And so the way that they did that was first by saying that the war was not about slavery, but it was about states' rights and it was about tariffs. Well, it was only about states' rights in order to have the right to enforce slavery. It was only about tariffs in order to have tariffs in place to protect cotton, which was propitiated by slavery. It always comes back to slavery. So the war was about slavery. And in his memoirs, the final part of the memoirs, Grant said, we must recognize that this war was about slavery. Well, they hated Grant for that because Grant was exposing them for it. They also hated Grant because Grant beat their patron saint, Robert E. Lee. And there's still a debate today, who was the better general? I think they were both great generals in their way. However, those Lost Cause people who said that Grant was a bumbling idiot, they're the bumbling idiots because Grant's strategy won the war. And so what was his strategy?
What's bumbling about that? Right.
Yeah. First of all, he made sure that they kept the different Confederate armies separated. Before Grant, the Confederate armies, if one of them was having a problem, they'd send troops from another army to bolster it. And then once that emergency was passed, they'd send the troops back. And so they kept doing this. And it was one of the reasons why they kept winning. And Grant said, we're going to stop that. We're going to keep them separated. And the way that he did that was that he appointed commander over the Army of the West, which was William Tecumseh Sherman. And he won in Atlanta. Then he appointed an army in the Southwest, and that was Benjamin Banks. And then he appointed an army in the Shenandoah Valley. And then he, along with General Meade, who was the commander over the Army of the Potomac, went against Lee in Virginia. So that none of those armies could break off then. They all had armies that they were fighting that they couldn't get away from. The other thing that he did was he said, we're going to fight every day that we can. Whereas before this, under people like Joseph Hooker or George McClellan, they would attack Lee. They would usually lose to Lee, and then they would retreat back across the river, retool, get more men, more supplies, wait 3 or 4 months, and then attack again. When Grant crossed the Rapidan in May of 1864, he started to attack, and he never stopped attacking until the surrender at Appomattox. He said, we're going to fight. And he wrote after Spotsylvania, which was a terrible battle. They were all terrible battles,
right?
Because he just kept pounding. But he wrote to Secretary of War Stanton, who shared it with President Lincoln. And Grant said, I propose that we fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. Well, it took all summer, all fall, all winter, and most of the spring. But they finally won in Appomattox in April of 1865. And then the final thing that Grant did was that he stopped the prisoner exchanges, because what would happen is they would exchange the northern prisoners for the southern prisoners, and that would put healthy, strong people back in.
Right back in.
Yeah, exactly. And Grant said, I know that we're going to have to sacrifice our men and leave them in those prisons, but we have an endless supply of people to bring in from the north, and every soldier that Lee loses is gone. And so his army is shrinking with every
How did he have an endless supply and the South didn't?
Well, for one, the population of the North was 4 times larger than the population of the South. And for another, the South had to leave a certain amount of people to keep the slaves from revolting.
True. Okay.
And the slaves were running the plantations to keep the economy running and keep the armies fed and so forth. And so it was just, if you ever watch Gone with the Wind, which by the way is a lost cause viewpoint.
Okay.
If you watch it again, you'll see that, the slaves didn't mind slavery. These are all our friends.
They loved it. Oh,
that's
yes.
another part of the lost cause, that they were happy with it. The lost cause said, well, if they weren't slaves learning, they would be in Africa and be heathens and whatever. So we're being good to them. And they ignore the treachery, they ignore the beatings, they ignore, the sick, the illnesses. And, it was
all the inhumane conditions.
Yeah, there were some families who were like that, some who did take the slaves in almost like family, but the vast majority were not.
Like brutal.
It's propaganda again. But if you look at the beginning, one true thing from, and there is some truth in Gone with the Wind. There's a whole lot of non-truth too, but there's some truth. And one of the true things is what Rhett Butler said when they're debating in the party at the Ashley Wilkes house. And he said, we don't have a single cannon factory in the South, and their population is 3 or 4 times bigger than ours. And they have all this industry and all these resources. What do we have? Cotton. How are we going to fight with cotton? And he was right. And anyone who was not hot-headed should have known that, but they didn't. And they went into this war. And basically, I think what they were thinking was that cotton was going to save them, because their gospel was that cotton was needed by England and France in order to make clothing, and that England and France would therefore come in on the side of the South to defeat the North, just like France came in on the side of the Americans in the Revolutionary War. Well, that didn't happen. And the reason that it didn't happen is that England and France had gotten rid of slavery decades ago, William Wilberforce and that whole gang. And so they couldn't come in on the side of a slaveholding country. And that is one of the reasons that whole thing backfired on the Confederates.
What made you decide to write about Ulysses S. Grant in the first place? I mean, you're writing all these other books. I mean, did you just sit down and have lunch one day and go, I want to write about him? There must have been something about these stories you're hearing, or had you heard any of these stories? What was the first thing that said, I have got to tell more about this man's life?
Well, as I said earlier, in the late 1990s, I watched Ken Burns' Civil War, and he talks about this thing that happened at the end of Grant's life in that documentary,
Oh, yeah.
and that caught my attention. And then I started digging deeper, and the more I dug into it, the more
The
I
more
was
you
like,
found.
I am really impressed. And the more I learned about Grant and his character, the more I realized that not only was he given a bum rap, but he was truly a great man and a role model for us today in not just his character, but also in his stance for freedom, in his stance for equal rights, and in his love. He picked up the banner of equal rights and racial equality that Abraham Lincoln dropped when he
Right.
was assassinated. And we don't give Grant that credit, but he also saved the Union both in the war, but also in the peace. And when he ran for president, his slogan was, "Let us have peace." And he was able to keep the country together
Wow.
uh, when it could have easily gone into another civil war. The other thing about Grant that people don't realize is that during his presidency, he pushed through major Reconstruction legislation, including anti KKK laws. He developed the Department of Justice, and his attorney general, along with Grant and along with the army that occupied the South, almost destroyed the KKK. And they were really very weak for the next 20 years after Grant's presidency. We don't talk about those kind of accomplishments and how Grant really uh, saved the Union twice. And so when I learned that, I said, this is someone we need to
It pricked your heart.
we need to look at him again, and we need to teach our children this is a role model for us today.
Well, and I know you to be a man of deep faith, and the men you write about also have that faith element. How do you find your own faith strengthened or played a part in, or did I just answer that? You seem to have this connection with men um, who have a deeper faith, or at least one that might not be quickly recognizable until you study it.
I choose my subjects matters. Faith is a part of it, but I think that justice and reconciliation are equal parts with that. So, for example, I have a book that I'm hoping to see published soon about a survivor of the Holocaust. And she was not a Christian, she was a Jew. But that is a story of humanity's darkest depths and brightest highs, and a contrast between the two. And so I wanted to tell that story as a moral tale, because it can happen again. It is happening again.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so there are a lot of people who deny that the Holocaust happened, or they downplay the Holocaust. I am seeing, surprisingly, what I would call Holocaust exhaustion, where people are tired of talking about it. And I have actually heard people say, well, there have been a lot of, genocides. Why do we focus on the Jews? And it's that just in itself smacks of anti-Semitism.
My gosh, yes.
And so I choose my subjects um, with the hope of shining light in dark places.
Yeah. Well, I do look forward to reading this one too. But earlier you mentioned Mark Twain and how he came into his life. Did he have any part of writing the memoirs? I mean, if you've got this guy with cancer sitting there with a pencil, I could just see him going, okay, come on, tell me the story. I'll write it down a lot faster than you. How was he involved, if at
Well, I
all?
love that you asked that question, because that question has lingered all the way up until when Ron Chernow wrote his book. There were a lot of people who wondered that. And
Hmm.
so Chernow wanted to answer a few different questions in the writing of his book. One was, was Grant an alcoholic? He did prove that, yes, according to today's definition, we
He
would consider
was.
Grant an alcoholic. But the other question is what you raised. did Twain really write the memoirs? Because the memoirs are considered American literary classics, and they are considered on par with Caesar's commentaries in as far as a military memoir is concerned. Well, that doesn't fit the lost cause narrative that he's a
Right.
bumbling idiot, does it? So it must have been Twain that wrote them.
Right.
So Chernow, because of the success of his books, and especially because of the success of Hamilton, was able to call the Library of Congress and say, "Hi, this is Ron Chernow, and I want to come down and look at the manuscript, the actual printed,
Right.
what not printed,
Handwritten.
handwritten manuscript of Grant's memoirs." And they said, "All right, since you're Ron Chernow, Craig von Buseck couldn't.
Neither could Christine Bacon. Yeah.
Right, but Ron Chernow can and did, and they pulled out this drawer and pulled it out, and it was all Grant, except towards the end, Grant was getting so sick and so weak
Yeah.
that they hired a stenographer. Noble E. Dawson was his name, so it wasn't Twain.
Twain.
Yeah, well, and remember, Twain was busy with his publishing company. He was busy promoting Huckleberry Finn. He was writing. He wouldn't have had time anyway, which in itself answers that question. But Noble Dawson was there. So towards the end of the document, you could see Noble Dawson's handwriting. You could see some of Twain's little notes in the margins, but that was just editorial notes, and they were very minor. But the vast majority was written by Ulysses S. Grant.
That's amazing. I write and I'm sitting here typing. I don't know how many people would even know my handwriting anymore. So to be able to see that 200 years later to me, that's kind of cool.
I know. I would love to see it someday. Hopefully,
Yeah.
hopefully I'll have the clout to see it someday.
I'll go be friends with Chernow.
Yeah. Well, hey, Ron, if you're listening,
BFFs.
yeah, you and me, we're going to the Library of Congress.
Oh my God, that's awesome. No, so I asked you about your faith, and I know you touched on the fact that Grant was a devout Methodist, but did his faith, how did his faith sustain him during you got cancer. I watched my mother-in-law die of cancer a year and a half ago, and it was wretched. It was wretched.
I'm so
and I
sorry.
asked her at one point, I said, "Maggie, what does it feel like?" Because she would cry out, and we tried to give her only a little bit of medicine so that, like you said, we could keep her, cogent. But we had to give her some. And she said it felt like she was being bitten all the time, like somebody was biting her. So if I'm picturing Grant laying in bed, and my mind was thinking about what my mother-in-law said. So this excruciating, like knives and daggers and glass.
And you can't eat.
Didn't even think of
You
that.
can't eat. He stopped eating. He just drank milk. And he said it was like drinking molten lead, lava. And so he was shedding the pounds. He became a skeleton.
So you have to have your faith strengthened during that. I know as a Catholic, we talk about the benefits of suffering, which a lot of faiths kind of want to push that away. But when you look at, there's a value to your suffering, you can contribute towards other people's redemption and salvation by offering it.
It's a very biblical view.
Yeah.
And the other faiths that push it away, they push away what the Bible actually says.
Right. So here's a guy, in my mind, I'm going, he must be Catholic. Okay, maybe he wasn't, but he knew he'd be suffering as he wrote that. And yet he was being able to do it. The will is one thing, but then having the strength to do it. What do you know about
the heroism of what he did is hard to comprehend in light of what you're saying.
Yeah.
It truly was an act of love. And that was the other part of it. Yes, his faith was very strong, but he also loved his wife and his family, and he knew that he was doing this for them. But going back to his faith, one of the things that surprised me, as I told you, I went to several of his homes, and one of them was his birthplace on the Ohio River, just outside of Cincinnati, Point Pleasant, Ohio. And the actual home is still there. And I went behind the house, and there was a bronze plaque that was placed there to the memory of Grant's Huguenot ancestry. And the Huguenots were very strong Christians that came out of France. And so then I went inside, and on the wall, they had a list of the Methodist ancestors and the Huguenot ancestors coming together. And one of his Huguenot ancestors fought in the Revolutionary War and was killed in battle, uh, which is amazing because, you know, the blessings come down, they're passed down through the generations. So, yeah. And then Julia, her grandfather was a Methodist minister. So he married into a strong faith community as well. And throughout his life, Grant was not a talker. In fact, they called him the Sphinx. And the book opens, you know, I tried to use that as a metaphor in the opening paragraph of the book, with him sitting on a camel looking up at the Sphinx in Egypt during his 2-year world tour, to basically set the stage that
Right.
here's the Sphinx looking at the Sphinx. And so he didn't talk about his faith very much. And so there are some people who think that he was not as much a person of faith. But when you read what he wrote about his faith
Can't not see it.
and the fact that he was a regular churchgoer, there's a lot of evidence that he truly was a believer. In fact, there was a Sunday school union that was doing a big campaign to promote Sunday school in America. And they asked if President Grant would write something to promote this. And I'm paraphrasing, but basically he wrote, hand hold tightly to the truths of Scripture, for all true civilization is based upon this book. I mean,
Wow.
you can't be
You can't not be
a
faithful.
non-believer and make a quote like that.
Well, and
Then the
let's
other major thing that he said was the opening to his memoirs. The very first line, he quoted Thomas Aquinas, the great
Catholic scholar, theologian.
scholar from the Middle Ages. And he said, man proposes, but God disposes. Well, why would a man quote something like that if he wasn't a person of faith? I don't think he
Right.
would. And so
Yeah.
I think his faith sustained him through all of his life,
Well,
but
and you
especially those last years.
mentioned too to me about this really having an element of a love story, because I'm thinking I'm dying of cancer. I'm wanting to live this life of quiet, basically quiet life out of the spotlight for the sake of my Methodist faith, or just whatever reason. I'm an introvert, but to push
Which is,
through that.
both of those are true.
Right? But to push through that pain and those two things for my wife. I mean, I do marriage. It's my ministry. I do marriage research. I do marriage seminars. I save marriages. And so here's this guy doing this for his wife in excruciating pain. It cannot not be a love story. And you mentioned to me, there is an element of a love story in there. Talk
Oh,
about that.
they are wonderful. And I highly recommend you use Ulysses and Julia in your ministry, because they truly loved each other from
Mhm.
almost first sight. They both loved to ride horses. And so when they were young, they'd go off into the woods of St. Louis. You know, back then there was just wilderness everywhere. And so they'd go riding horses. And, but fast forwarding to, you know, the later years, when he was in the war, in the Civil War, he recognized that in order to keep his promise to his wife and to protect his reputation, he had to have accountability to not drink, because everyone around him was drinking.
Yeah.
And it was very difficult for an alcoholic. And so, whenever possible, he would have Julia staying with them. So to this day, you're there in the Hampton Roads area. If you go to City Point, which is just on the other side of the river from Petersburg, the cabin that the Army built for Ulysses and Julia is still there. It's the original cabin.
Wow.
And you could go see where they had, it was a 2-bedroom cabin with like a little dining area in the front. So it was in the shape of a T. So the kids would sleep in one room if they were there, but they were off and off at school. And then Julia and Ulysses were in the other. So for many, many months, Julia was with him right on the battlefield, not in the battlefield, but in the zone.
Right.
And so there would be times when they would be in the mess tent just by themselves, and they'd be off in a corner holding hands and just talking to each other. And another officer would walk in and they'd pull apart, and their faces would get red as though they were like teenagers or something, you know. But they would love to do this, and they loved to spend time together. That was his favorite thing in the world.
Hmm.
And then one of the best stories that really is amazingly touching, Grant is being promoted to lieutenant general, and he's going to have his promotion ceremony in the White House with Abraham Lincoln, and Julia is not able to go, and she feels bad about this. But now her husband's the top man in the entire army with 1 million men under him,
Right.
and she's thinking he's getting so important, and I'm just a simple little plantation girl from St. Louis. Well, she had strabismus really bad, so her eyes were greatly
Oh, okay.
crossed, and so she went to a doctor to see if she could get her eyes straightened, because this doctor had been telling her for 20 plus years you could have a surgery and have those straightened, but she was afraid
That she'd
of
go
the
blind or
surgery.
something.
Yeah, that she would go blind. Remember, this is,
Yeah, 1800s.
1800s. This was very new. And so she never did it. But now she finally got the courage, because of her love for her husband, to go get her eyes fixed. And by this time, the doctor said, I'm sorry, but you're too old. We can no longer do the surgery. So she went to Washington when she was finally able to go. And she told this story to Ulysses. And he pulled her into his arms, and he looked deep into her eyes, and he said, these are the eyes I fell in love with. I don't want you making any experiments with these eyes, because I might not like you as much. So you need to promise
Oh,
me that you will stay just the way you are, because that's what I love. And that is a wonderful love story. And so on his deathbed, there was Julia holding Ulysses' hands right up until the moment he took his last breath. It's a really wonderful love story.
wow. You must have just loved reading these details. I mean, to me, these details are what I like. Oh,
Yeah,
what a
well,
good
I,
person.
I love the research part of the
Yeah,
process.
you're very good at that. You're
Well,
very
thank
good.
you.
Well, I just want one more question. A reviewer of Victor observed that I was cheering on Grant's final victory over enormous adversity while simultaneously mourning the absence of such a great servant leader in our day. What lessons can leaders today learn from the example of Ulysses S. Grant?
I think that Grant is needed today more than ever, except for maybe during the Civil War and his presidency.
Yeah,
Um, we need people who are going to embrace the same type of servant leader position. So I'll give you an example. There were 6 generals before Ulysses S. Grant took the top spot, 6 generals that were head of the Army of the Potomac. Of those 6, 4 of them were complete braggarts. They were
mm,
full of themselves, and that included General Joseph Hooker and John Pope and George McClellan. McClellan, especially, when you read the things that he said about Lincoln and the way that he disrespected him, um, anybody other than Abraham Lincoln would have thrown him in prison for his
right.
behavior. And so when Ulysses S. Grant came along, Lincoln was shocked, because Pope and Hooker and McClellan would constantly say, the enemy has way more troops than we have. They have way more supplies. I need horses, and I need more equipment, and I need more men. When Lincoln knew from his intelligence and the people who went out and scouted that just the opposite was true. The Union armies were far larger than the Confederate armies. So they were always begging for all these people, but then they would criticize Lincoln even when he did supply them. Whereas Grant came in and Lincoln said, what do you need? And Grant made out a list and he gave it to the president. The president said, this is all very reasonable. He gave him exactly what he wanted. Grant said, thank you very much. And he went to work. He never complained. He never begged. He certainly never criticized Lincoln. In fact, it was just the opposite. He was very much staunchly behind Lincoln, to the point where in the spring of 1865, Lincoln had just gone through the second inauguration, and he's been fighting this war for 4 years. And the paper had said that he was so weak and sick that he had to have his cabinet meetings in bed. So the cabinet members came to his bedroom because Lincoln was so frail from the war. And when Grant read this in the newspaper, to his wife said, well, why don't we invite him here to have a vacation? And Grant said, I think that's a wonderful idea. And by this time, Ulysses Grant and Abraham Lincoln became friends, not just boss and general, but friends. And so Grant reached out to Lincoln and said, why don't you come and spend some time here? The troops would really be bolstered by your presence, but it will also give you a time to rest a little bit and get away from Washington.
Right.
And Lincoln said, I'm on my way.
Yeah.
And so he spent, I think, 2 weeks there among the troops and watching. And some of that is in the Lincoln movie by Spielberg. You see them there in the Petersburg area. But that was the last time that Lincoln was able to rest. And then, of course, he went back to Washington and was assassinated. So Grant was always there. Whatever Lincoln wanted him to do, he did it unless he thought that it would be, bad for the army or bad for the country. And then he would respectfully argue his point, and usually Lincoln would back down. So there was this mutual respect. There was this honor between the two people that we don't have today, and that really needs to be restored to our leadership. So Grant and Lincoln both are role models that I hope we see emerge as things move forward from here.
Man, that would be wonderful, because you are right. What is missing from our society, from our marriages, and absolutely from our presidency, our leaders, is respect, is honor, is those things that made us esteem a leader, a hero,
Right.
So one last question then. Well, maybe two. So did this book, as everything we do in our life, how did this book change you?
Wow, that's a good question. I think that, the second book follows up on the first in that it talks about the principles that I learned of leadership from Ulysses S. Grant. And so, servant leadership, of course, is one of those principles, but I had already gotten a good dose of that going to Regent University.
Right.
And there were other principles, his faith in God and his love for family. But I think that one of the principles that really was an eye opener for me was and I actually called the second book Forward, just like you would say to your troops, forward, march.
Right.
Because Grant was someone who always moved forward. In fact, Horace Porter wrote a book called Campaigning with Grant. And Porter was one of Grant's closest aides and good friends in life. And Porter wrote that Grant almost had a superstition about retracing his steps. So he was a typical man. He didn't want to stop for directions or go back. He wanted to keep going forward. And I think that there is much to be learned in that. Some people, they have adversity in life, and that's going to come. We just all eventually have adversity. Some people have tragedies. Some people have disappointments, and a lot of those people, they get stuck. There's that whole concept of arrested development.
Yep.
For whatever reason, a tragedy happens in their life, and they're arrested in that moment. Grant never allowed that to happen for him. No matter what happened, even in the major tragedies of his life, when he got kicked out of the army for his drinking, he kept moving forward. When he had the farm fail, he kept moving forward. When he was accused of being a drunk in the Civil War, he kept moving forward.
He was on his deathbed and he kept moving forward.
That's exactly my point. And I think that that is something that I really came to admire in him and say, well, that's really something for all of us, that, though we may slip, even maybe fall, we get back up and we
keep
move
going
forward.
forward. Wow. How can people get their hands on a copy of this book called Victor, the Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant?
They can go to grantvictorbook.com or anywhere where books are sold. It's available. They could go to their local bookstore. If they don't have it on the shelf, ask them to order it and to put a couple of copies on the shelf.
Right.
So anywhere along
Amazon, Audible. Do you have an audio
it
book
does
yet?
not have an audio book yet. I'm hoping that the publisher will green light that.
Kindle?
There is Kindle, yes.
Excellent.
And then, of course, they could go to my website, which is just my last name, vonbuseck.com, VONBUSECK.com.
And when you click on this link, we'll have it listed below here. You guys can go straight to his website from the show. You know what? I'd love for you guys to share this show. I can't even express enough how much Craig's writing isn't just a book. It is you feel heart, my heart pounds when I read it, but I feel, well, what that reviewer wrote of this book, that I was cheering as I read the other books that I read, because I haven't finished this one yet. So I want to be honest about that. But, you have an exquisite gift. And I hope
Thank you
that
so much,
people, I hope they see that, because I think of all the historical books out there, I think this would be the one that I would have people read. And I'm not just saying that. Let me just say that I wouldn't have Craig on my show if I thought his books were just okay. His books are phenomenal, very good gift from God. But enough
Thank
of
you
that,
so
right?
much.
You are welcome. So as he said, vonbuseck.com, but just take this show, share it with someone else if you think that they're a history buff and they might be interested in it as well. But Craig, you have been a gift to me. I look forward to having you on again. I hope you have 1 million copy sales of this book and your others, and let me know when you're going to write the next one. I'd love to have you on here.
Well, thank you so
Maybe
much,
when Forward
Christine.
is done, right?
Forward is done. It comes out May 25th.
Oh, okay. Well, then
Yeah.
you can get it both in the same spot.
Yep.
All right. Well, I don't know if I ever told you how I end my shows, but just remember the word sunny side up when I do this, okay?
All right.
Thanks to each and every one of you for watching and listening. I appreciate it. I am Dr. Christine Bacon. You've been watching Breakfast with Bacon, and I want to remind you always to live your life sunny side up.